Chapter 15, Section 3. Darwin presents his case. When Darwin returned to England in 1836, he brought back specimens from around the world. Subsequent findings about these specimens soon had the scientific community abuzz. Darwin learned that his Galapagos mockingbirds actually belonged to 3 separate species found nowhere else in the world. Even more surprising, the brown birds that Darwin had thought to be wrens, warblers, and blackbirds were all finches. They too were found nowhere else. The same was true of the Galapagos tortoises, the marine iguanas, and many plants that Darwin had collected on the islands. Each island species looked a great deal like a similar species in the South American mainland, yet the island species were clearly different from the mainland species and from one another. Publication of On the Origin of Species. Darwin began filling notebooks with his ideas about species diversity and the process that would later be called evolution. However, he did not rush out to publish his thoughts. Recall that Darwin's ideas challenged fundamental scientific beliefs of his day. Darwin was not only stunned by his discoveries, he was disturbed by them. Years later, he wrote, "It was evident that such facts as these could be explained on the supposition that species gradually became modified, and the subject haunted me." Although he discussed his work with friends, he shelved his manuscript for years and told his wife to publish it in case he died. In 1858, Darwin received a short essay from Alfred Russel Wallace, a fellow naturalist who had been doing field work in Malaysia. That essay summarized the thoughts on evolutionary change that Darwin had been mulling over for almost 25 years. Suddenly, Darwin had an incentive to publish his own work. At a scientific meeting later that year, Wallace's essay was presented together with some of Darwin's work. 18 months later, in 1859, Darwin published the results of his work, On the Origin of Species. In his book, he proposed a mechanism for evolution that he called natural selection. When he then presented evidence that evolution has been taking place for millions of years and continues in all living things, Darwin's work caused a sensation. Many people considered his arguments to be brilliant, while others strongly opposed his message. But what did Darwin actually say? Inherited variation and artificial selection. One of Darwin's most important insights was that members of each species vary from one another in important ways. Observations during his travels and conversations with plant and animal breeders convinced him that variations existed both in nature and on farms. For example, some plants in a species bear larger fruit than others. Some cows give more milk than others. From breeders, Darwin learned that some of this was heritable variation, differences that are passed from parent to offspring. Darwin had no idea of how heredity worked. Today we know that heritable variation in organisms is caused by variation in their genes. We also know that genetic variation is found in wild species as well as in domesticated plants and animals. Darwin argued that this variation mattered. This was a revolutionary idea because in Darwin's day, variations were thought to be unimportant, minor defects. But Darwin noted that plant and animal breeders use heritable variation. what we now call genetic variation, to improve crops and livestock. They would select for breeding only the largest hogs, the fastest horses, or the cows that produce the most milk. Darwin termed this process artificial selection. In artificial selection, nature provided the variation and humans selected those variations that they found useful. Artificial selection has produced many diverse domestic animals and crop plants, including the plants shown in Figure 15-10, by selectively breeding for different traits.